All right, good afternoon and welcome everybody. It's nice to see so many of you. We already have 70 and I'm sure a few more will join in the next few minutes. So if you attended the first two Behavioral Health Tuesdays, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. My name is Lindsay Simpson. I'm the program administrator for the Center for Evidence to Practice. We are a collaboration between the Louisiana Department of Health Office of Behavioral Health and the LSU HSC School of Public Health located in New Orleans. And our mission is to help the state in expanding access to evidence-based programs for behavioral health providers that serve the Medicaid population. So in this series, this Behavioral Health Tuesday series is through a SAMHSA grant to provide support to behavioral health practitioners during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this series specifically focused on self-care and vicarious trauma. So thank you all for joining us. If you would like to access the first two sessions, I will drop the link to our e-learning platform where the recordings and the materials shared are posted, both the handouts and the slides. And this course from today will also be included there. And if you watch it as a 3-part series, you'll have access to CEUs through that platform. Throughout today's session, we will be using the chat feature a lot, and Dr. Philippi will let you know if you can unmute and if he wants anyone to speak. And just so you're all aware, we are recording this session, so just keep that in mind as you're sharing. All right, my last announcement is for CEUs. Just if you're interested in receiving a CEU certificate, the cutoff is 45 minutes for participation. So try to stay for as much as the hour as you can if you would like the certificate. And if you called in by phone, let me know through email who you are, because it'll just show up in the participant log as your phone number. All right, well, I will hand it over to Dr. Stephen Philippi, the director for the Center for Evidence Practice.
Excellent, thanks, Lindsay. Same instructions as last time, treat this like you would a conference. Certainly want to have open conversation. So using the chat, using your unmute features, but if you'd say it in a conference, it's probably safe to say it here. But it is just a note that we are recording it so we can put it up on the e-learn platform that we have. So for many of y'all, welcome, and a whole lot of y'all, welcome back. We are going to jump right in. So this is round 3, as Lindsay said, and I continue to be excited and humbled and appreciate the fact that anybody's willing to give up an hour of their world, their life to come hang out with me. So thanks for that. So I'm curious where y'all are at. So you can type it in the chat function. If you want to unmute yourself and just say it, you can do that too. But I'm curious how y'all are doing. Where are you today? Tuesday, March, whatever it is. Some people are home, Oak Grove, Ruston, tired, losing hours of sleep. So I'm there too. I haven't fully come back yet either. Relaxed. So some of y'all took me very literally about where are you? And some of y'all are actually checking in. So both are fine, but doing well, very tired, drained in Metairie, Louisiana. Fantastic. And Trudy, you're raising your hand. I don't know if you meant to do that on purpose, but if you've got something to say, you can unmute yourself and say it. And I see I'm good. You know, a lot of people all over the state. Well, fantastic. Tired. Finish ACT testing. Wow. That would kill me. Anyway, on spring break, what are you doing on this call? Good for you. But enjoy, staying positive. Several recent deaths, family and church. I'm sorry to hear that, Richard. But I'll take that as a segue because that's kind of where I'm at. I went to a funeral today of a longtime friend, and it's always very hard to see somebody in that final place and try and figure out how you go on. But that was, it was good. She was very good to me all my life, so it was very good to be there with her. and be there for a funeral. But it's always hard. And my kids are also at the cousin of their very young cousin who died last week unexpectedly. So a lot of grief, which is unfortunately a segue for today. So instead of doing a whole lot of stretching exercises like we done last week, y'all don't be disappointed. I know some of y'all said you really liked the stretching one. I think we just need to breathe, and that's where we'll start. So just breathe for a second. Take a deep breath in and hold it. Blow it out, like way out, like all the way out, and hold it out. And then breathe back in slowly. And hold it for a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and breathe back out. All right. And keep breathing. It was one of the things I was reminded at the funeral today is you get so caught up in the moment and the emotion of the moment. And that was the first thing that came to mind walking away and thinking I had to do this training this afternoon. It was like, you got to remember to breathe. And sometimes that's just where you need to be. So where have we been? We've been on self-care. Anybody remember anything from self-care? What did we talk about? Those of y'all have been with us a few times. Taking breaks. Thank you, Monique. Critical to engage in, right? If you don't take care of yourself, who's going to? Importance of intentionally taking care of yourself, right? So planning for it, making time for it. You remember that whole plan. So both Jane and Carla, same thing. That plan, that intentionality, that if I'm going to really take care of me, how am I going to know I'm doing it? And how are other people, which is a great validation, going to also know that I'm taking care of myself? Boundaries, good. Bubble baths, perfect. Making the plan and following through. So the one thing I'll say about the plans and follow through, because I know this is just, we do a lot of planning. A lot of us are doing a lot of this work with other people and families and clients where we're making plans. And just remember, there's a rare moment that anybody really does their plans perfectly. So if you're a little bit better than you were when you started the plan, you're on track. This is, go back to those, sorry if I give anybody PTSD from this one, but go back to your Psychology 101 days, right? And it's that successive approximations that you learned all through behavioral training, right? So getting a little bit closer and a little bit closer and a little bit closer is how most of us change. So give yourself a break if you didn't come out of the starting gates and totally, win over your plan and do it 100%. That's fine. If you're making progress, that's all that matters. All right. So then we started talking about trauma and secondary trauma. What do y'all remember from that? You can either unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat. What was the whole deal with trauma, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma? Can be as harmful as primary trauma. Yep, thank you, Carla. Absolutely right. So we literally can start going through the exact same symptoms of PTSD if we end up severe enough along that secondary trauma. So absolutely. So those of y'all that treat people with PTSD, struggling through PTSD, you're literally doing that same kind of behavior yourself, and you didn't experience the trauma. Fight, flight, or freeze, absolutely, Sarah. So we get that overload, just like the people we work with get overloaded. We do the same thing, right? So we end up having reactions to being exposed to trauma over and over again, and we ourselves, right, can go into that very traumatized brain that just goes into autopilot instead of really being thoughtful and problem solving. So thanks for that. Seek therapy too. Jane, you nailed it, right? So one of the cornerstones of self-care, one of the cornerstones of good compassion fatigue, work and secondary trauma work is people that are really resilient, and we'll talk about resilience today, but people that are really resilient, one of the factors that are in those populations of people is when they need professional help, they ask for it. They know to ask for it. So absolutely, good call, Jane. So I'm going to jump in today. We're going to talk about the longer impact of collective trauma. We're going to talk about disasters. What do we know about disasters? What do we know about grief? And then get into resilience. Let's get there. So we've seen this. This is the third time y'all have seen this, right? So not all stress is bad. So we're not talking about a stress-free world. We need a little bit of stress to keep motivated, keep moving, and then we perform optimally. But the stuff we've been focusing on is this other side, the demands that exceed abilities, right? The chronic excessive stress and the wear and tear that does on us and our bodies and our minds. This look familiar? What is this? The feeling that you're feeling is called? What is this? All right, I'm sending y'all all back to your behavioral health 101 classes. If somebody's got to know what this is. Grief, right. Thank you. Oh, you nailed it with the Kubler-Ross. Very good. Stages of grief model, absolutely. So, right, so we know this, right? And it's amazed that, that when we look at grief and we know it, but when we start going through it ourselves, we start forgetting. We are so good at being compassionate with other people and walking them through these stages of grief, which, by the way, we know don't follow in this order all the time. People cycle through, cycle back, cycle through, cycle back. It's not like you just get to do it one time and you're out the door. Right, but you go through this, you know, this phase of where you jump in with denial, right? It couldn't have really happened. My 16-year-old daughter summed it up so well because she told me the other day when her cousin, she got word about her cousin's death, and it was about 24 hours later. She just looked at me. She said, "Dad, I feel like I should feel differently, but I'm shocked." And I'm like, "That's exactly where you're supposed to be. He wasn't supposed to be dead. You know, you've literally had 24 hours, and the concept of your 32-year-old cousin being dead, it's not there. I mean, it hasn't even begun to sunk in." So she was right where she should be. So just that whole denial, you know, this can't really be happening. This couldn't really potentially be happening to me or us. And then we get anger, right? So this isn't fair. It's not right. Why them? Why us? Fill in the blanks with all that anger. And then bargaining, right? So it can't be all or none because we don't deal well. Most of us don't deal well with all or none. So we start bargaining. You know, well, what can I hold on to? And you watch that with people that are going through grief, and we start talking about applying this to like disaster recovery and everything else. What part of my old life can I hold on to? I don't want to give all that stuff up. Those of y'all that have been through the recent hurricanes this year and everything else, you know, I'm walking away from my entire house, my home, my neighborhood. What can I keep? What can I go retain? And we go back and forth on this bargaining, try and keep a little bit of who we were while we're being forced into this new reality. And then when the bargaining doesn't work and that sadness and that grief still exists, we get depressed, right? But most of us don't like being depressed, so we start exploring what is this new life without that person, or without that neighborhood, or without that fill in the blank post-disaster stuff. And we get back to accepting life. One of the best books, and I may have mentioned it earlier in the series, but that I read was, and it just starts really making sense. And I say this with a whole lot of compassion in the world of just looking at stress and trauma, because I don't wish trauma on anybody. But there's a book out called Anti-Fragile, and the whole concept that we're actually not as fragile as sometimes we put ourselves out there to be, or psychotherapist or behavioral health people might push forward that we are. We're actually pretty damn resilient, incredibly resilient, when you think of what we go through in a life and how we recover and we keep moving on. And I'm not saying it's easy by any stretch of the imagination, but I really do truly believe we're not as fragile as some people make us out to be. That we truly are incredibly resilient human beings that do pick up pieces and move on. And Richard, I absolutely agree. I've seen this with cancer, absolutely, terminal illness. Any of those things that disrupt, you're dying to some part of who you thought you were. And that also goes to disasters too, right? You're giving up that stability. You thought you were safe in this place, in this home, in this area, and then all of that's disrupted. And our community feels this too, right? So this isn't just an individual. So a lot of us work with individuals, but and this is why I sit in the world of public health, but populations experience this. So we have entire populations that are now going through this, and we're going through it together, but also individually, also separately as different families, different groups of people, different neighborhoods, but we're all going through this, and you can watch this go through, in entire populations and societies as they grieve as well. So I'm going to complicate it just a little bit. So that Kubler-Ross, whoever called it correctly, absolutely right, that stages of grief and everything else. So it's also been applied in a way to kind of looking at disasters and phases of disaster. And if you really think about it, it kind of goes through the same way. But one of the things that I notice about this is just look at those timetables, because these models were largely built around natural disasters like a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake, landslide, all those wildfires, things that people experience. These haven't been so much built around pandemics, but I still see the pandemic in here if you really think about COVID and the pandemic, right? So you go through and that you get that initial threat, and then you start seeing the impact, and you see the heroes coming to action, right? I remember vividly seeing that giant medical ship pulling into New York City, right? The Navy medical ship. I remember talking to people, nurses and docs that were flying into these big cities because they were going to go work in these hospitals that were being overrun. There was all sorts of heroism, and we were paying even attention to the heroism of people that were still working in grocery stores, right? People that were still willing to deliver mail in your Amazon packages. I mean, there was a lot of uncertainty in all of this a year ago, and there was people rising to it, right? But then the community comes together. Now we're in this together. Look, our nation shut down, and we did. Some were more on board than others, but for the most part, we shut down as a sign of national cohesion around a response to a pandemic. And you guys remember it well, I'm sure, in the world of behavioral health. I mean, we're literally trying to figure out how to do telehealth overnight, right? Offices are closed down. How do I still see patients? How do I manage this world that I'm working in? And but you've got cohesion. People are working together trying to solve problems. And then you start seeing it unravel a little bit. And you start seeing that that slide into, and this is more of that whatever we were expecting. It's almost like when that trauma that we talked about, the snake in your face and that trauma reaction, that that adrenaline flow goes up and everybody's on board trying to get with it, and then all of a sudden I can't work at this pace anymore. I can't keep this up, and it starts sliding, this disillusionment after disillusionment. People get tired, right? When is this going to end? When is this going to be over? People start getting into their reset of reality, which is this isn't anything like we were living just a week ago. And this goes through apply any disaster, but definitely the pandemic too. And then trying to figure out how do we start picking up. And I wish that line was more like little loops, because I do think we still have those highs and loop back and highs and loop back. I don't think it's as much of a straight line, but we start coming to terms, but then anniversaries hit, right? We just passed the 1-year anniversary of the first cases being noted in the US. Here in New Orleans, the first certificate issued for a positive COVID case was a year ago. And we start looking at these markers, and there's reactions to that too. Have we come so far? Oh my God, all the stuff we've lost. What are we doing? And we're still in the midst of putting pieces back together. So none of us are here 100% with all the answers, solutions, pieces back together. If you think about like even the vaccine, I know there's a lot of memes out there, but one of my favorite, and it's not to make a joke about the vaccines, but if you remember in the kind of heroic nature of all this, we couldn't get a vaccine soon enough, right? Everybody championing, we're going to get vaccines in the fastest that we've ever been. We're going to get this stuff out. And then all of a sudden the vaccines arrive and it's like, oh, yeah, that's really great that we did the vaccines, but I'm not taking it, right? So now we're in this whole stretch of human reaction to, is the vaccine safe? Is it not safe? Should I get vaccinated? Should I not? Should I be waiting for those that need it more than I? Or should I take advantage of it when it comes? I mean, there's so much stuff going on, even as we rebuild. But we do get, and I do love the end of this story, which is there's a new beginning to whatever comes next. But we are as a population, as human beings, as I said just a few minutes ago, I do really think that we are not as fragile as sometimes we think we are. And we really do come together. And you watch this disaster after disaster where people come together and they rebuild. One of the things that I even looking through this pandemic and all the woes that you could say, as I looked around New Orleans and what's going on in New Orleans, I also looked and said, you know what, this city rebuilt. And I honestly think it rebuilt stronger in so many ways post-Katrina. And I expect the same post this pandemic. At least I hope the same. There's no guarantees, but I would hope. So a lot to say that all that grief gets very complex in populations as we start moving as well. I do want you to note at the very bottom there, it does say 1 to 3 years, and we are going to come back to that. None of this is going to turn around overnight. And we're talking about 1 to 3 years of a natural disaster. This is one of those points in time kind of thing. So I don't know what this looks like fully for a pandemic, where you've got this whole year of start, stop, pandemic, threat, all that stuff, to then I don't know what that does to that timetable. I don't think anybody knows yet. So, so the community feeling grief, us struggling through this kind of moving through disasters and where we want to be. We do know a lot about disasters. There's been a lot of research on disasters, and there's injuries and death. I have been in a lot of discussions, being in the world of public health and in behavioral health with a lot of people that I love dearly, but I'm sure many of y'all had those same reactions, like, oh my God, I can't put up with social media anymore. And I've had that with my own family, right? So, all I do is pause when I hear all of everybody's opinions and everything else about COVID and said, you know what, there's 500,000 people that died in the US in this last year. I don't have anything else to say. We lost 500,000 people. It's horrible. And you guys, if we broke down the list of people on this call, some of y'all have had such a major impact of that in your own worlds and your own lives. I obviously, I'm not African American. I don't live in some of the African American Black communities in New Orleans, but I've had the honor to work with some of those groups on this very material and everything. And the magnitude of death they see in their own very small neighborhood, it's hard to fathom. I mean, the amount of funerals, deaths, the funerals they couldn't even attend because everything was shut down. It's hard and unfathomable in a lot of ways. But there's been a whole lot of death, been a whole lot of injury, psychological injury as well as physical injury. We're just now seeing more and more of the reports from the pandemic about the sustained injuries of people that have recovered from COVID but are still struggling. We know there's mental illness and physical illness, and we know that those go together in a lot of ways. We know that mental illness increases within weeks and months of a disaster, so we do expect a spike in behavioral health concerns and issues. And as I've told many people as we were preparing even to work with the state on things like this and response for behavioral health folks, and how do we do a targeted response to communities in need, we didn't have enough behavioral health workers before the pandemic. We certainly don't have enough now. So we do, there's notable spikes in behavioral health issues that are going to be there, and it's going to be there for a while. The literature says it's lasts for about 6 months after the start of a disaster, the experience of a disaster. Again, how that translates into pandemic, we have a lot less information on, but we do know some research says it actually goes a lot longer, including some research that a group and I did in Baton Rouge after the Baton Rouge floods in, what was that, 2016? We tracked it a year post flood, and we were still seeing elevated amounts of behavioral health, especially things like depression, substance abuse. And so PTSD, depression, common consequences that we see from disasters, also anxiety, complex grief, right? So what we mean by complex grief is all sorts of things, but it can mean complex grief in the sense that, you're a provider dealing with your own loss, your own trauma from events, and also having a foot in the world of helping other people that are also surviving that same disaster. And that can be that complex. It can be people that have multiple losses where it's you don't know where the first one ends and the next one begins. There's no breathing time. The complexity of multiple losses in short periods of time. We also have watched spikes, including in this pandemic, in substance use, domestic violence, abuse, neglect, things like that. So we also expect physical illness to increase, because we know very well, and the literature is very clear on this, as mental health goes, so does physical health, and vice versa. So both interact with each other. So what else? And this is what really speaks to me from the pandemic standpoint. What else do we know about disasters? People that are isolated do worse. So I can't begin to imagine, again, I'm very grateful to be healthy and 52. I can't imagine being 75, cognitively with it, and in a nursing home where I'm isolated now from everybody outside of some staff, everybody that I held dear to me, right? That isolation, we know it packs on the stress. And then you look on the other stressors, homelessness, financial burden, the rate at which people were losing jobs, or rate at which people have lost homes, the car, what do they call it when they come and get your car after you don't pay your bills, whatever that's called. Anyway, the number of those people having their cars confiscated for not being able to pay their bills. Repoed, thank you, Marty. So all of these are increased. So what do we do? What do we do? And I think that's the important question. Mental health first aid reminds us of one thing that I absolutely love. And this isn't a class on, I'm sorry, not mental health first aid, psychological first aid. I always get them mixed up. Psychological first aid is, just so y'all know the difference. I know mental health first aid is very popular. A lot of people know what that is, but that is training a lay population to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental health issues and things like that. And then being able to help connect them to services. Psychological first aid is actually training for behavioral health workforce to actually go in right after disasters and help people find a stable place that includes shelter, food, everything else. And then if they need screening for, if there are psychological problems, how do we connect them to services? But this is like the behavioral health first responders training. if you haven't had it, highly recommend it. I'm trying to keep up with the chat here too. Psychological first aid, NTSN is available. Danita, thank you. It's a great course. I highly recommend it. Monique, I see your comment about your dad passing away. Just all of that. Yeah, absolutely. All of those triggers that come from just trying to grieve the loss of people that we love. I'm very sorry about your loss too. It's all of this, none of this is ever easy. But I do want to call it, without going over the whole attention to psychological first aid and everything it deserves, I'm going to call your attention to two things. One is, this is why we started on self-care when we started this whole series. Calming yourself first. You can't rush into a disaster response if you're not in a place where you can respond, right? It's the ability to be able to respond, right? To be responsible. Somebody broke it down, probably cliche when I first heard it, but it makes a lot of sense. Responsible really breaks down to, if you go backwards, it's the ability, right? You are able to respond if you're responsible. And that's first lesson in psychological first aid. Is one of the first things is you got to be in a place of being able to care for yourself enough where you can go be there fully present for other people that also need your help. And that's a tough thing to do when we're also going through the same disaster that our clients are going through. Just so you know, in case you want to go to, and Moni, I'm trying to remember who pointed that out in the chat, but whoever pointed out the chat, so NTSN, absolutely, the link is here. If you wanted to go see it, it's available. Information's available, training's available, but it's an evidence-informed approach, spans the life, children all the way through adults, and it's for the aftermath of disaster and terrorism, right? So you're being that frontline worker that goes in and helps people find that safe place to start recovering and link to services. Focus on initial distress. It's not long-term. It's like you're an ER worker, basically. How do we get things contained enough where it's safe enough for that person to then start building that longer-term functioning coping? It does not assume, and I love this about it because I think this goes to speaking to that whole concept of anti-fragile as well, right? Does not assume that the survivors of disasters will develop severe mental health problems. But we know that many will, so you watch. So what do we need to watch for? So that's what it really looks for is what's your baseline? How are you doing? And if you see these things occurring, how will you know and how will you get help? So starts that problem solving early with people. This is a very dense slide, so apologies, but these are just the core functions of psychological first aid. And you know these overall basic behavioral health concepts. I'm not going to dive into each one of them, but it's just more there. You know, that first contact, that engagement. How do we let people know that we're there to help, and how do we engage them where they are, non-judgmentally, compassionately, and all that kind of stuff. Safety and comfort, safety, right? People don't feel safe. Their mental health just deteriorates. The basic comforts, you know, do you have shelter? Do you have food? Do you have those things that you need to survive? So you don't panic, you don't have to go be overwhelmed by just basic survival. So you're stabilizing, calming, gathering information. What are your current needs? What are your current concerns? And again, this isn't all behavioral health healthy. If they just say my biggest concern is I need to get shelter for my kids and some food, that's where we start. It's not, you don't have to go into the deep dive of, oh my God, you look so anxious. You look like you're panicking, all that stuff. If what you need is shelter and food, that starts the stability, that's where we start. So it can be very practical, connecting to social support. So you're not their only support. They don't feel isolated, alone, connecting them to other supports, and then giving them information and helping link where you can help link to to services, knowing what services are out there. Angela, I see you raise your hand. I don't know if you want to turn off your mic and ask a question or if that was accidental, but we're going to assume it was an accident then. All right. So creating a sense of safety, creating that calm, creating that self and collective efficacy. So y'all know this. I think I'm going to focus in on that last point, but creating self and collective efficacy. So when we work in disasters, the one thing that we note differently, especially from a public health perspective on behavioral health, we talk a lot about self-efficacy. And just to be clear with everybody, self-efficacy is building that belief in a person that they have the ability to do whatever they're being asked to do, that they can do it, that they've got the support, the resources, that they have the mental capability to pull off what they're being asked to do. So you want to build that, right? Because we know the higher somebody's self-efficacy, the more likely that they are to follow through, the more likely they are to recover, be resilient, and things like that. But a lot of people don't know about collective efficacy. You can do that same things for populations. You can do that same thing for neighborhoods, for families, for neighborhoods, for entire cities, districts. But we can build that sense that we do have the ability to actually get through this. We do have, and it's not false advertising, right? It's true belief that you're building in a population that we can get to whatever the other side of this is. And being part of that is being part of psychological recovery and psychological first aid. Creating connections, definitely, I don't ever want to be somebody's only connection. So whatever you can do to create connections with other people. Life is much bigger than me, and creating that hope, create hope, create hope. And I would just say, because this was the 5-minute overview, if you want it, as pointed out in the chat and also pointed out in the link, go get trained. You can go get trained. It's very easy to access. So I encourage anybody that is involved to do that. So I want to take this whole transformation into resilience. And one of the things that my final thing, I said there was 2 big things of psychological first aid. So the other one is 2 or 1. It's 1 is none and 2 or 1. In psychological first aid, nobody goes into helping in a disaster by themselves. And so you're always connected to somebody else. The compassion fatigue is real. The burnout is real. The likelihood of secondary trauma is high, and we know this for the people that go in and try and help. So they make sure that you don't do this alone, and it's just smart common sense. So you're teamed up with people. This is a team effort. You go in together, and you don't do this in isolation. And this would go to y'all that are in private practice as well. Don't do this alone. Even if you're in the most private of private practices, connect with another professional that can walk this walk with you and be there to share in some of the struggles and what's going well and what's not going so well. So make sure you have your support, which also connects to then resilience, right? So I'm going to sum up all the studies on resilience in this statement at the end. If you look at all the resilience literature, and there is lots, and it's growing immensely every year, the number one thing you see in almost all studies of resilience is the fact that the people that are resilient recognize they have supports in their lives. So this is where that isolation, go to the other extreme, isolation kills. Supports are what save people and get them through to the other side. So they've done tons of studies on veterans that have gone into incredibly intense traumatic situations, and those that come out that end up with PTSD and those that don't. And one of the things that is the cornerstone of who goes what direction is how much supports did they have before they went into that, whatever that traumatic event was. And the people that have more supports do better when they come back. You have things, you have people, you have places that you can lean in. You're connected with other human beings, which makes us do much better in life. Now, I'm going to complicate supports a little bit. So we know, and I'll get that in 1 second, but we know resilience. So support. I'm just going to leave that right there. Resilience it talks about coping with that stress. When that needle is over in the red gauge of being overly stressed, it's overwhelming. We cope better if we're resilient. We have this resilience qualities, these protective factors for resilience. We cope better with stress. We don't avoid it. We acknowledge it, that we are stressed, that this is stressful. So don't avoid it. Don't stuff it. We're resourceful and problem solving. So we're constantly looking at what can we do to make this different, that I'm not stuck, right? I'm a survivor versus a victim. I'm trying to figure out how to survive this. More likely to seek help. We talked that early and somebody pointed that out. But if you are resilient, you're more likely to seek help. And then that belief that there's something you can do, right? You know, and I encourage people to even think out of the box in the middle of the pandemic on a lot of these things. You know, even if it was just bringing in your neighbor's trash can so they didn't have to go out, or if you had an elderly neighbor, just to ask them, can I pick you up some extra stuff while I'm at the grocery store so you don't have to go out? There's so many things you can do that helps us feel better and able to cope. Other things that are connected with resilience, self-disclosure of trauma to loved ones. Now, there's a big difference, and y'all know this well from working in behavioral health. There's a difference between people that just spew out disclosure all over the place and people that are actually connected to people that care and mutually share the disclosure of trauma. What has it been like for me? What was it like for you? Or being able to, you know, to have that trusted person in your life that you can share with is the important thing. Not just the cathartic vomiting out of here's all my traumatic experiences doesn't have a whole lot of gain in terms of resilience. Spirituality. So those of y'all, I know from the first time we talked about self-care and resilience, a lot of y'all mentioned more religious kind of tones of spirituality, which is absolutely fine. But however you see yourself, that there's something bigger than you in this world, and whatever you want to call that, however you practice your religion, however you practice spirituality, but it's that important concept that if the only thing you have to rely on in this life is limited to you, that's probably going to be a very narrow, tough place to be. So it's that concept that there's a bigger thing out there in this world that you can also rely on, you can tap into, that helps us all move forward. Having that identity of a survivor, I've already mentioned, versus victim. Helping others helps us so much. People that help others, but it puts you at risk for vicarious trauma. Go back to our last talk. And also just the positive meaning out of trauma. One of the things that I was very humbled and reminded by, the more you work with people who have survived trauma, the more that you'll notice incredible skills that they pulled sometimes out of nowhere. It was something innate in them that they were doing. Incredible skills that families pulled out to support each other through things. Incredible just intellect, right? That you were not only intellectually strong, you were physically strong to get through it, but you're also intellectually, psychologically strong. Imagine how you could have just crumbled and you didn't. There is all sorts of positive stuff, including, we know from the trauma literature, people that have survived trauma tend to also be amazing problem solvers. You know, they've had to solve really tough problems in life. So they end up with some problem solving skills that a lot of us have never had to tap into. And I told you I was going to complicate support. And so I do underline over and over again, the resiliency letter is very clear that you have to have support. That's the number one factor that brings people into a very resilient place in the face of trauma. What I'm going to complicate is support's not all the same, and you actually need 4 kinds of support. One person could actually deliver all 4, but most of the time you don't find this in one person. You usually find this in multiple people in your world. And you guys can start thinking in your own terms about what this might look like in your own circle friends and supports and colleagues, but you need emotional support, right? The people that are there that connect with empathy, caring, love, understanding with you. That's how most of us envision a lot of our support, is those people that validate how crappy things are and help us through and make us know that our falling apart is understandable and everything else. But you also need informational support. And this is where good information guidance, maybe you haven't thought of this, maybe you could think of this, maybe you could approach this. Informational support is really important. Instrumental support is that concrete. This goes back to psychological first aid, right? Sometimes you don't need all the emotional, informational stuff. I just need dinner tonight for my kids. I just need dinner tonight. I need a shelter tonight. Who can provide that concrete, tangible assistance? I always ask my students when I teach this in our mental health courses every year, like if you got a flat tire today leaving school, who would you call? People that have instrumental support are going to be like boom, boom, boom. And of course, most of them say AAA. Apparently, everybody's got AAA in their back pocket now. But instrumental support is like that. Who do you call when you need something, physically need something, and who are those people? And the more you have, the better. And then this is the one we don't care for as much, but it's critical. Appraisal support. These are those people in your life that tell you what you don't want to hear. Just gonna pause right there for a second. We need this, right? We need those people in our lives that don't just validate everything we think and believe and feel. That's important, but we also need those other people in our lives that say, whoa, this isn't okay. What you're doing worries me. If you keep going down this path, I'm really concerned this, and this. And they can do it in compassionate ways, but they give you the truth that sometimes you don't want to hear. And so we need all four of those. So all of that stuff leads to resilience. It buffers stress. It's all good stuff. So I'm going to switch gears in our final minutes, and I want you to think about this in your workplace, right? So all of this we've been talking about kind of more your individual self as behavioral health workforce and providers and people providing care. But as you are in the midst of a pandemic, as your workforce has also entered into this disaster and disaster recovery, we were just told at LSU that we're supposed to be back in our offices April 1st, right? So we're starting whatever this next phase is, and we don't know what this looks like. But what about your workspace? I want you to think of this. I saw this early on in the pandemic, and don't worry about the itty bitty tiny print. I'm gonna blow it up for you so you can see the whole thing. But Tim Nolan, humanservicesleadership.org, put this out. And it just caught my attention. It was right at the early onset of COVID, and it made a lot of sense, right? So the fear zone, where you've got a lot of people, including yourself. Do you complain? Do you spread emotions related to fear and anger? Do you get mad easily? Do you forward messages, all messages that you receive? Do you just keep hitting forward, inundating other people? Do you grab and hoard supplies? We won't even talk about toilet paper and things like that. I mean, it's just that fear zone where you're going into that self-protective place where I don't know what to do. And look, if you were there, this isn't a judgment. This is just, and I think all of us, if we took an honest appraisal, probably fell in every one of these zones at some point, a little bit, a lot of it, whatever. But I've had my fair share of complaining during this thing. I've let it go, and I'm sure, my colleagues certainly have heard it. But if you don't want to be in that zone as a work, you've got these other two zones. I told you this is where I was going to blow it up. Just trying to get so the learning zone, right? So evaluating information before you just forward it on. This is the part of social media that drove me nuts with all my friends and family, and I still do call them friends and family, but these are the people that would just forward anything, right, on social media, because it came into their inbox. It must be true. Let's forward it. And it caused a lot of stress and a lot of tension. Same thing happens in the workforce. Do we recognize that, we don't have all the answers, but we're trying to do our best. And it's not to everybody's liking, but we're trying to do our best. Start to give up what I cannot control. which is a hard one. For most of us, we don't run the organizations we work for. So, you know, how much control do I have and how much do I just have to let go because I can't fix this all. Identifying my emotions, so I'm not just fueling emotion on everybody else I work with, but, you know, being able to say, you know, this is mine. I'm owning this. I'm happy today. I'm sad today. I'm frustrated today. Identifying and owning it, making it yours, not blaming, not saying it's the fault of everybody else around you or your organization. Becoming aware of the situation, think how to act. So that's that problem solving brain kicking in. And then the growth zone, you know, and this is where I think we would hope to be in work, but being more appreciative of others, letting people just know how much, you know, none of this was easy. And I appreciate you showing up. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you putting forth this effort. A lot of us have adapted in fantastic ways. And I think one of the most common things we talk about at work right now is I hope we don't give up a lot of things that we've learned through this pandemic, because it wasn't all bad. And we've actually learned a lot of things that could make our organization potentially even better. But we've adapted a lot. So how do we learn those lessons and make sure we don't lose them? Being empathic with both yourself and others, that certainly helps. Making your talents available, live in the present, focus on the future. We can't do anything about changing the past. The past is what it is. It's the one thing that we won't ever change. And spreading hope, that self-efficacy, right? Building up that belief that we really can do things differently. And then practicing patience, and creativity. So that was just, I thought it was pretty brilliant. I don't know that there's any real major research on it. I just thought it was a brilliant piece that came out early in the pandemic. I'm like, oh, that's good stuff to hold on to. So where are you in your organization? I would encourage you, just like we did a self-assessment at the beginning of this, you know, assessing your own workplace and, you know, where do you fall in all this? And if you're in between all three zones, such as life, there's good things and less good things about every workplace. So I am going to pause there for a couple of things. One is I get all these boxes and chat boxes out of my way so I can read this to you. But I do want to just remind us in all three of these series that we've talked about, and I know this one was a little bit less interactive, so I apologize. There's a lot of information, more informational than interactive. But I do want to note that trauma is a part of life. One of the things that I think is probably the most unreminded part is that, you know, this is life. Religion in a lot of ways came to the front historically many years ago, because this is what they recognized, right? Life is hard and then you die. And they were like, oh, we've got hope, and this is the hope. So, you know, religion certainly taps into this. Successful populations, cultures, healthy groups, healthy partnerships, they realize this, that nothing is without its stress and struggles. So recognizing that trauma is part of life and just kind of embracing it, almost like a radical acceptance that this is part of living. Unfortunately, it's just the reality. If you're trying to avoid trauma, you landed on the wrong planet, the wrong lifetime. So trauma is part of life. How we help or hurt the response matters. So, you know, what we bring to the table is helping professionals. How we identify or limit the impact of trauma. So the reality that trauma is part of life is absolutely just being real and engaging in a world that is full of trauma. We work with people that are traumatized. We are surviving our own exposure to trauma. But what we focus on is how do we buffer some of that impact so it's not psychologically harmful, and or how do we help people recover when it is psychologically harmful? And hope and people matter, right? That being hopeful, that self-efficacy, that focusing that we do not do this alone, and that's the greatest hope, is you don't ever have to do this alone. And then recognizing that you absolutely matter. You have shouldered a huge burden as a behavioral health workforce, as a helping professional in the middle of a pandemic, where I can just begin to imagine all the stuff you were juggling in your own personal life while also trying to help other people put pieces together. And just remember, you matter, so you got to take care of yourself. You can't take care of all these other people and do all that good. So on that, I will say thank you and give you back hopefully 3 or 4 minutes of your day you weren't expecting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Philippi, for that presentation. We appreciate everyone's participation in this 3-part series. I just posted the link to E2P Learn if you would like to access the first 2 sessions. We will be sending out the CEUs first thing tomorrow. And yeah, again, thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate your involvement.